The morning Alara Voss arrived at Thornfield, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the rain had already turned the lane into a river of brown mud. Her carriage stopped at a broken gate that hung at a crooked angle, missing two of its iron bars. She stepped out carefully, her cane pressing into the soft earth, and looked at the place her husband had sent her to forget about. The farmhouse was standing. That was the most generous thing she could say about it. The stone walls were dark with damp, and the front window on the left side had been boarded up with planks that had since warped and split. The garden was a tangle of dead grass and nettles. One of the chimneys had a visible crack running from its top all the way to the roofline. A crow sat on the crumbling edge of it, watching her with no particular concern. Bess climbed down from the carriage behind her, took one look, and said quietly, "Right then." That was all. Bess had always been a woman of practical instincts, and standing in the rain was not going to change anything. She began pulling their single trunk from the back of the carriage without waiting to be asked. Alara walked the muddy lane to the stables first. She had been told there were horses on the property, and a horse was a living thing, so it mattered more to her at that moment than the state of the kitchen. She pushed open the stable door and was met with the smell of damp straw and long neglect. 3 horses stood in their stalls, and none of them were in good shape. One was an old bay gelding with a swollen left knee. The second was a gray mare with ribs visible beneath her coat and a dull, defeated look in her eye. The third, a chestnut pony, was standing in the far corner of his stall with his head low, and when she approached him gently, she could see he was favoring his right front leg. She stood there for a long time, just looking. She had never managed horses before. She had ridden as a girl, briefly, the way all girls of her station were expected to. She had learned to sit correctly in the saddle, and had been told that was quite enough. But she had always paid attention, which was something most people around her had not noticed, because in the world she had come from, paying attention was not considered a skill worth acknowledging in a woman. She counted her money that evening at the kitchen table, with a single candle lit, and rain drumming steadily on the roof. 42 pounds and a few shillings. She had the farm's paperwork in a folder that the Duke's man had pressed into her hands at the last moment, and she spread it all out on the table and read every word carefully. The farm had debts, not enormous ones, but real ones. 31 pounds owed to a feed merchant in the market town, and a smaller amount owed to a local farrier who had not been paid for 3 visits. The land itself was hers outright. The Duke's solicitor had made sure of that much, presumably to avoid any future obligation on the Duke's part to contribute to its upkeep. He had given her the problem and washed his hands of it. She intended to solve it. The next morning she dressed carefully, took her cane, and walked to the town. It was 2 miles, and the road was rough. She arrived at the feed merchant's shop with her back straight and her face composed, and asked to speak to the owner. A large man with a red beard and cautious eyes came from the back. His name was George Croft, and he had been waiting with very little hope for someone from Thornfield to address the debt. He had heard about the Duke's wife being sent there, and had assumed the property would quietly fall further into ruin, while whoever was left in charge pretended not to notice the bills. Alara looked at him steadily, and told him she was the person in charge, and she intended to pay the debt, but not all at once. She proposed this: she would review and manage his accounts for 6 months. She had been trained in bookkeeping as a girl, a skill her father had insisted on, and that she had quietly continued to practice in the years since. In return, he would extend her a credit line on feed and supplies for the same period. Croft looked at her for a long moment. He was not the kind of man who made quick decisions, but he was the kind of man who recognized when someone was talking sense. He said he would think about it and send word by the end of the week. She thanked him, bought a small amount of oats with the cash she had brought, and walked home. Croft's letter arrived 4 days later. It said yes. She found old Tom through Croft, who mentioned that there was a former groom living on the edge of the village who had worked with horses all his life and was currently mending fences for a neighboring farmer because he could no longer afford to be selective about his work. She went to find him. Tom Barker was past 60, with hands roughened by decades of outdoor work and a way of moving around animals that was slow, deliberate, and absolutely confident. He looked at Alara with the same careful attention she had given the horses, and he asked her a single question. "What are you planning to do with those animals?" "Make them well," she said, "and then make money from horses. Good horses." He considered this for a moment. Then he said he would work for reduced pay for the first month, while they sorted out whether the arrangement was practical. And after that, they would renegotiate. She agreed. It was the most professional conversation she had had in years. Pip arrived at the farm the following week, entirely by accident. She found him sleeping in the empty fourth stall in the stable, having apparently crept in sometime during the previous night. He was perhaps 14 years old, though he was not entirely certain of this himself. He had a thin, sharp face, and the look of someone who had been suspicious of kindness for so long that he had almost forgotten it existed. She did not call the constable or make any kind of scene. She asked him if he was hungry. He was. She fed him, and then she told him that if he wanted to work, she had work, and if he did the work properly, he could have the room above the tack room and 3 meals a day. He stared at her, like she had spoken in a foreign language. "You're not going to send me to the poorhouse?" he said. "Not unless you give me reason to," she said. "So don't." He started work the next morning, with Tom and Pip alongside her, and Bess keeping the household from falling apart entirely. Ilara began the slow, demanding work of bringing Thornfield back to life. Her leg would not allow her to stand for the long hours that stable work required, so she adapted. She made her assessments in the mornings, when she was fresh, leaning on her cane and watching the horses with focused attention. She gave clear instructions. She supervised everything. And in the evenings, by candlelight at the kitchen table, she read. She ordered every book she could find on the subjects of horses, equine health, bloodline breeding, and land management. Croft arranged them through his contacts in the city, adding the cost to her account. She worked through them all with the same focused attention she would have brought to a legal document, learning the proper terms for bones and joints, understanding how weight was distributed in a horse's body, studying why certain conditions developed and how they could be prevented or treated. The gray mare with the visible ribs was the first to improve, because her problem was the simplest. She had been underfed and badly neglected, and with proper food and genuine care, she began to recover within 3 weeks. Her coat lost its dull look. She began holding her head at a normal height. She started watching Pip with an affection that made the boy glow every time he entered her stall. The old bay gelding's swollen knee was a more complicated matter. Tom believed it was a long-standing condition that would not fully resolve, and he was right. But with careful management and a change in how he was kept, the gelding became comfortable and mobile, if not fully sound for hard work. Ilara sold him honestly, at a fair price, to a local farmer who needed a gentle horse for light carriage work and could not afford a sound one. She told the farmer exactly what the horse's limitations were before any money changed hands. The farmer was surprised by her honesty. He paid fairly and told 2 neighbors about the transaction. That was how the reputation started. With the money from that sale added to her careful management of the feed budget, she had enough to look seriously for a proper horse. She wanted a young mare with good bone and a sound constitution, something with genuine potential that other buyers might have passed over. She began attending the local auctions, sitting quietly in the back with Tom beside her, watching the animals led out into the ring one by one. At the 3rd auction she attended, she saw the dark bay filly. The auctioneer called her difficult, almost before he finished describing her color. She had arrived at the auction in poor condition, and during the preview that morning, she had refused to be led calmly, pulling against the halter and throwing her head repeatedly. 2 potential buyers had walked away from her without a second glance. Most of the others had not bothered to look at all. Ilara watched her for 20 minutes from the fence line before the auction opened. She did not see an animal that was aggressive or dangerous. She saw an animal that was frightened and had learned to express that fear through resistance, because nothing in her recent experience had taught her that resistance was unnecessary. The filly's eye was intelligent. Her bone was excellent. Her movement, in the small moments when she forgot to be afraid, was fluid and free. When the bidding opened and stalled almost immediately at a low number, Ilara raised her card once. No one raised against her. She named the filly Constance, which seemed right for an animal that would need steadiness, modeled for her, before she could produce it herself. The work with Constance began the day she arrived, and was slow, and demanded more patience than almost anything Ilara had ever done in her life. She did not try to force the filly into obedience. Instead, she spent long hours simply being present with her, learning what made the horse nervous, and removing those things one by one where she could. She spoke to her quietly and consistently. She rewarded small moments of calm. She was steady in a way that Constance had clearly never experienced before, and gradually, over weeks, the horse began to change. Old Tom watched from a respectful distance. He had worked with horses for 40 years, and he recognized what he was seeing. He had not expected to see it from a woman with a cane who had never managed a working stable in her life, and it impressed him in the quiet, serious way that real things impressed him. He said nothing about it for a long time, but one evening, when the work was done and they were walking back toward the farmhouse in the late light, he said, "She's from good blood, that one. Better than anyone at that auction knew." Ilara looked at him. "Tell me what you mean." And old Tom began to talk. He had recognized something in the filly's physical characteristics, in the particular set of her head and the distinctive conformation of her shoulder, that reminded him of a stallion he had worked with 20 years earlier. That horse had been called Meridian, and he had been one of the finest animals Tom had ever encountered. Meridian had been owned by a gentleman who fell into financial trouble, and his estate had been dispersed quickly and carelessly, with the horse's papers handled in such a rush that several bloodline registrations had never been completed properly. It was possible, Tom said, that this filly was a descendant of that line, on her dam's side, but without papers, it was only a feeling. Ilara listened to all of this without interrupting once. When he finished, she asked him 2 questions. First, what would it mean for Constance if the bloodline could be proved? Second, what would it take to prove it? Tom answered both questions honestly. The first answer was significant. The second answer was complex but not impossible. Ilara went inside and picked up her pen. Over the following 2 months, she wrote letters. She wrote to breed registries. She wrote to the estates of deceased gentlemen whose horses had been listed in old sale records she tracked down through back issues of agricultural journals. She wrote to a retired clerk who had handled the Meridian estate's paperwork, and who, though elderly and partly retired, had kept meticulous personal copies of all his records out of professional habit. She wrote clearly and precisely, and always explained exactly what she was looking for, and why. The replies came slowly, but they came. The retired clerk was the crucial one. He wrote back with more detail than she had dared hope for, including a registration chain that connected Constance's dam directly to a mare that had carried Meridian's foal in the precise year Tom remembered. The documentation was not perfect, because it never was in these recovered cases, but it was sufficient. When Ilara took it to the breed registry and presented her case in person, making each argument calmly and methodically, the registrar confirmed what she had argued. Constance was from Meridian's line. It was on record. It was official. Tom heard the news and removed his hat, which was the highest form of acknowledgement he possessed. Pip cheered so loudly that Constance startled in her stall. Bess said something warm about supper being ready and went back to the kitchen. Ilara stood in the yard with the letter of confirmation in her hand and thought about the man who had placed her here with 42 pounds and an air of quiet contempt. She did not feel angry. She felt something cooler and more useful than anger. She felt clear about things in a way she had not been in years. Constance was worth 10 times what she had paid. At the next breeding season, Ilara arranged for her to be bred to a well-regarded local stallion with strong complementary bloodlines, and the wait began. But she did not let the wait be idle. Word had already begun moving through the district that there was a woman at Thornfield who understood horses in an unusual way. The story of the bay geldings sold with full and honest disclosure had traveled, as honest dealings always do in country communities. A landowner 3 miles away brought her a difficult pony that had been refusing to be shod for months. She spent 2 careful afternoons with the animal and solved the problem through a combination of patience and a small adjustment to the handling routine. She charged a modest fee. Another man brought her a young horse with a puzzling reluctance to move forward under saddle. She watched him for 1 full session and asked 3 questions, and the answers led her to examine the animal's back carefully. There was a small area of sensitivity that had gone unnoticed. She recommended a different saddle fit and a period of rest followed by carefully graduated work. She charged a modest fee. Each time, the outcome was good. Each time, someone told someone else. The foal was born on a cold morning in early spring, and Ilara was there when it happened. She had slept poorly for several nights leading up to it, rising to check on Constance at hours when the rest of the farm was quiet, and the only light was the lantern she carried from her bedroom. Tom had been patient about sharing the nighttime vigil, but Ilara had insisted on being present, and when the moment came just before dawn on a Tuesday in March, she was in the stall with her cane against the wall and her sleeves rolled up, not because she needed to intervene, but because she needed to see. The foal was a dark bay colt with a white star on his forehead. He was on his feet within the hour, staggering and determined in the way that newborn horses always are, and Constance, who had never been a mother before, circled him with a care that made Alara's chest ache in a way she had not expected. She named him Meridian's Promise. Pip shortened it immediately to Promise, which stuck without argument. Promise was everything she had hoped for. His bone was strong. His temperament was better than his mother's, though still full of energy. And by the time he was weaned, it was already clear that he was an exceptional animal. He moved with a quality that visitors to the farm noticed before they were told anything about his bloodline, which was exactly the kind of quality that serious horsemen trusted more than any piece of paper. She did not breed Constance again immediately. She gave her a full year to recover and enjoy her foal, because Alara had come to believe that animals treated with patience and genuine respect produced better offspring than animals driven without consideration for their well-being. This was not a view that most people in the horse trade shared, but Alara did not need them to share it. She needed results, and the results she was seeing confirmed everything she thought. By this point, Thornfield had changed almost beyond recognition from the broken place she had first stepped into. The stable roof had been properly repaired. The paddocks had been cleared and refenced with solid timber. The farmhouse was warm and organized, and the kitchen garden that Bess had taken over with great determination was producing more than they needed through the summer months. There were now 6 horses on the property, including Constance and Promise, 2 boarding horses whose owners paid a reliable monthly fee, and a young stallion Alara had purchased at auction in the autumn, using money saved from her assessment work. The stallion's name, as registered, was Blackwood Fortune. He was 2 years old, dark as coal, and had a temperament that required both knowledge and patience to manage well. Alara had the patience. She also had Tom, whose quiet confidence around the young horse was a steadying influence on an animal who had been handled inconsistently before coming to Thornfield. People were talking about Thornfield. They were talking about it more than Alara realized, because she did not spend much time in social circles and tended to be focused on the work in front of her, rather than on the impression she was making in the wider world. But word moves in country districts through markets and church steps and over garden fences, and the word about Alara's farm was consistent. She had the finest management they had seen. She kept horses of genuine quality, and if you brought her a problem animal, she would solve the problem honestly and charge you fairly for it. It was Croft who first told her that people were saying her name with a different kind of respect than they had used a year ago. He came to collect his accounts one afternoon, as he did each month, and sat at her kitchen table with his tea, and said it in his direct, unsentimental way. People have changed what they think of you, Lady Voss. It's not pity anymore. They're admiring you. She looked at him steadily. Good, she said. Pity was never useful to anyone. He gave a short laugh, which was rare for him, and they returned to the accounts. The accounts were looking considerably better than they had when she had first spread the farm's debts across the kitchen table by candlelight on her first night. The credit arrangement with Croft had been formally settled on time, every month, without a single late payment. The boarding income was steady. The assessment fees were growing as more landowners sought her out, and Constance's certified bloodline had already attracted serious inquiries about breeding arrangements from 2 parties, who had learned about Meridian's line through the registration announcement. She had arranged one such breeding and charged well for it, because the quality was real and deserved to be priced accordingly. The owner of the visiting mare had initially been surprised by her price. He had then agreed to it without argument, because Croft had told him about Constance's documentation before he came, and men who knew horses understood exactly what that bloodline certification meant. Colonel Desmond Fairweather arrived at Thornfield on a gray afternoon in October, 2.5 years after Alara had moved there. He was a tall man in his mid-60s, with the upright posture of a lifetime's military service, and the quiet authority of someone who had commanded both men and horses in difficult circumstances, and had never particularly needed to raise his voice to do it. He was retired from the cavalry, but he had remained deeply involved in the British horse world, and he was well regarded in circles that Alara had not yet had occasion to enter. He arrived without announcement. He simply appeared at the stable door, and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. Pip, who answered the door, brought him to Alara in the paddock, where she was watching Tom work with Blackwood Fortune from the fence. Fairweather introduced himself and said he had heard about the farm and wished to see it. Alara nodded and gestured for him to stand beside her at the fence and watch. She did not explain what Tom was doing or why. She simply watched, and after a few minutes, Fairweather began watching, with the same quality of attention she was giving, because what Tom was doing with the stallion was genuinely worth watching. The horse was being asked to move on the long rein through a careful series of transitions, and the subtlety of the communication between horse and handler was something you rarely saw. After 15 minutes, Fairweather said, "Who trained that groom?" "He trained himself over 40 years, Alara said. "He was being wasted on fence work when I found him. He is the finest horseman I have ever seen." Fairweather was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I would like to see the rest of the farm." She showed him everything. She showed him the stables and the records and the horses, including Constance and Promise and Blackwood Fortune. She showed him the tack room, which was organized with the same precision as her financial accounts. She answered his questions directly and without embellishment, and when she did not know something, she said so and told him how she would find out. He asked her how she had come to know what she so clearly knew. "Books," she said, "and watching, and making mistakes and learning from them rather than repeating them." He smiled at that. It was a small smile, but it reached his eyes. He stayed for tea, which became a long conversation about horses in general and breeding philosophy in particular. He found that her knowledge, though it came from books rather than from decades of personal experience in the field, was applied with such intelligence and good judgment that the distinction between learned and experienced almost ceased to matter. She was rigorous. She was curious. She was completely honest about what she did not yet know. He arranged to board 2 of his personal horses at Thornfield before he left. But before he went, he said something that changed everything that would follow. He said it carefully, in the way that people say things they consider important. He told her that there was a matter circulating in certain circles, not yet widely known, that the royal household was quietly seeking a new arrangement for the care of several horses belonging to the crown. The previous contracted farm had encountered serious difficulties, and a new arrangement was needed. A formal application process would be announced in due course. The selection would be rigorous, involving full inspection and independent review. He paused after saying this and looked at her. She said nothing immediately. He said, "I mention it because I think you should consider applying." She looked out at the paddock where Tom was finishing with the stallion in the late afternoon light. She thought about the 42 pounds, and the rotted roof, and the 3 lame horses, and the broken gate that had been the very first thing she saw of this place. "I will consider it," she said. He left, and she stood in the yard until his carriage had gone from sight. Then she went inside to her desk. She had things to write, and things to think about, and the idea that had just been placed before her was large. She intended to examine it from every angle before she decided what to do with it. Bess brought her supper at the desk that evening and found her writing quickly, filling pages with careful notes. Bess set the tray down without a word and went back to the kitchen. Pip, coming in late from his evening checks, saw the light still on under Alara's door at midnight. He mentioned it to Tom in the morning. Tom said, "Leave her to work." He said it in the tone of someone who understood that something was moving and had no intention of standing in its way. The formal announcement about the royal application process came through a letter forwarded via Colonel Fairweather's contacts in early winter. It laid out the requirements in plain language: facilities meeting a defined standard, documented records of bloodline management meeting specific criteria, 3 letters of recommendation from persons of established reputation in the equestrian world, a formal inspection conducted by the Crown's Master of Horse, Sir Reginald Brand. Alara read the requirements once, very carefully. Then she made a list of what she already had and what she still needed. The facilities were close to the required standard, but needed targeted work. Her existing documentation was strong, and she would spend the coming months making it stronger. The 3 letters of recommendation were the part she thought about most carefully before she moved. She did not write to anyone immediately. She thought first. She did not want letters written out of pity or old obligation. She wanted letters written because the people writing them genuinely believed in what she had built. There were 3 people she knew would write such letters for those reasons. Colonel Fairweather, who had inspected the farm himself, and was not a man who offered endorsements carelessly. Lord Pembury, a nobleman whose notoriously difficult stallion she had been working with over the past year, with results that had astonished him. And George Croft, which surprised even her when the name arrived in her thinking, but which felt entirely right. Croft had watched her rebuild Thornfield from a debt-ridden ruin. His perspective was different from the gentleman's perspectives, and in a way, it might be the most persuasive of the 3, because it covered ground the others simply could not. She rode to see Lord Pembury on a clear, cold morning, with Pip driving the small carriage she used for longer distances. Pembury was an older man, with a direct manner, and a stallion named Rufus who had, before coming to Thornfield, developed such a reputation for being unmanageable that his value as a breeding animal was in serious question. Alara had worked with him steadily over 8 months. The change had been so significant that Pembury had told her himself, with some wonder in his voice, that he could not quite account for it. She explained about the royal application. She asked for his letter. He said yes before she finished asking. The letter from Fairweather was already promised. She wrote to Croft that same evening. He appeared at the farm 2 days later, hat in hand, visibly uncomfortable. He said he was not accustomed to writing official letters, and was not confident he would do it well. She told him to write what he knew, write what he had seen, use his own words. He did not need to impress anyone. He only needed to be honest. He took a full week. When the letter came, it was 4 pages long, written in his slightly unpracticed hand, but with a clarity and a quiet force that made Alara sit very still when she finished reading it. It described precisely what she had arrived with, and exactly what she had built, in plain practical terms, without sentiment, but with unmistakable conviction. It was, she believed, the most powerful of the 3 letters, and she suspected Fairweather would agree, if he ever read it. She submitted the application on a gray January morning, handing the sealed package to the postal clerk in town, with the same composure she brought to every significant task. The clerk stamped it and set it in the outgoing pile without looking up. She walked home through the cold, her cane marking the wet stones of the road, and when Pip asked her at supper how it had gone, she said, "Now we wait, and while we wait, we work." He looked at her with the particular expression he had developed over the past 2 years, the look of a boy who had learned that when she said something like that, she meant it completely, and that the work she meant would be worth doing. He finished his supper and went back to the stables. Sir Reginald Brand did not like surprises. He had spent 30 years in royal service managing horses, people, and expectations, and in that time, he had found that things ran most smoothly when they proceeded according to what he already understood. He reviewed applications, conducted inspections, and formed judgments, and in almost every case, his judgments confirmed what he had suspected before he left London. He did not suspect much about Thornfield when he read Alara Voss's application. The facilities sounded adequate. The documentation was thorough enough to justify a visit. The letters of recommendation were interesting, particularly the one from the merchant, which he read twice and set apart from the others. But the basic situation was unusual enough that he could not quite place it in any of his existing categories, and this made him quietly uncomfortable. He arrived at Thornfield on a Wednesday in late February, accompanied by a junior aide, with the practiced pleasantness of a man who had learned to be civil in circumstances he was not yet certain about. Alara met him at the gate. The gate was not broken anymore. It was solid and well hung, with good iron fittings, and there was a small brass plate on the right-hand post, with the name of the farm engraved clearly on it. Fairweather had suggested the plate. Alara had agreed that presentation mattered, even in the country, and she had commissioned it from the local blacksmith. She shook Brand's hand firmly, thanked him for making the journey, and walked him directly to the stables. She did not offer tea first, which he registered. It told him she understood that he was there to see horses, not to sit in a drawing room. The stables were immaculate. Not merely clean, he thought, as he walked the full length of the building with her beside him, but organized, with a quality of intelligence that was genuinely rare. Each stall was labeled with the horse's name, age, bloodline record, and current care notes, written in Alara's clear hand on small boards fixed beside each door. The bedding was fresh and carefully managed. The water was clean. The tack room was arranged with a precision that reminded him of the finest military establishments he had visited over the course of his career, where everything had a proper place and was reliably found there. He examined each horse carefully. Constance drew his attention immediately, and when Alara explained the bloodline and produced the documentation, he read through it slowly, asked several technical questions, and received answers that were accurate, detailed, and delivered without hesitation. He asked about Blackwood Fortune next. Tom brought the stallion out, and Brand watched him move across the yard with the focused, practiced attention of a man who had spent a lifetime judging animals. The horse was 3 years old now, and had developed into something exceptional. His movement was ground-covering and free, his temperament controlled but fully alive. "Your groom," Brand said, watching Tom lead Fortune back toward the stable. "How long has he been with you?" "Nearly 3 years," Alara said. "Where was he before?" "Mending fences on a neighboring farm," she said. "He needed to be found. I found him." Brand looked at her. She met his gaze without discomfort. He asked about Promise, who was approaching 2 years old and had the clear makings of something outstanding. He asked about the boarding arrangements, the financial structure of the farm, the feed management program, and the veterinary relationships she had established. She answered everything without pause. At one point, he asked about a specific and technical aspect of the breed registry documentation, something precise enough that most farm operators would have given a general answer. She gave him an exact one, including a reference to the specific clause in the registry's guidelines that applied. He was quiet for a moment after that. Then he asked to see her records. She brought him to the kitchen, which served as her office, and laid out 3 years of organized documentation on the table. It was arranged chronologically and by type: bloodline records, financial records, health and veterinary records, feed records, correspondence. He sat down and worked through it for 40 minutes, while she stood at the window and let him do so without interruption. When he finished, he closed the last folder and folded his hands on top of it. "Lady Voss," he said, "I have inspected a considerable number of equestrian establishments over my career. I do not say this easily. This is among the finest record-keeping I have ever encountered." She said, "Thank you," without making anything further of it. He stood and reached for his coat. "You will receive formal communication through the usual channels." She walked him to his carriage. His aide, who had been quiet throughout the entire visit, caught up with him and handed him his hat. Brand put it on, and for a moment he looked back at the farm, the neat fences, the repaired stone building, the orderly yard, the small brass plate catching the weak winter light on the gatepost. He wrote his report that evening at the inn where he was staying, and the notation he added to the final paragraph was brief and entirely plain in its language. "This woman is wasted in Yorkshire." He submitted his recommendation for approval the following Monday. The official letter, bearing the seal of the royal household, arrived at Thornfield on a Thursday morning in March. It came in the regular post, tucked between a feed supplier's invoice and a letter from the breed registry about a procedural update. Pip brought the post to Alara at the breakfast table and set it beside her plate, as he always did. She picked up the pile in order, starting with the invoice, then the registry letter, then the sealed one at the bottom of the small stack. She looked at the seal. She set down her tea. She opened it. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table beside her cup. Bess, who had been moving between the kitchen and the table, and had spotted the seal from across the room, stopped where she was and looked at Alara's face. Alara looked up. "We have been awarded the royal warrant," she said. Bess sat down heavily in the chair across from her, which was not something she did at breakfast, or indeed at any ordinary moment. Then Tom came through the back door with mud on his boots, and his usual morning report ready, and he stopped when he saw their expressions. Alara told him. He stood there in the doorway in his muddy boots, and his face, which was normally as readable as a fieldstone, did something that she had never seen it do before. It did not break into a smile exactly. It settled, the way a horse settles when it finally finds its rightful place after a long and uncertain journey. He nodded once, slowly, and removed his hat. Pip appeared behind him a moment later, not yet knowing anything, and Tom turned and told him in a few plain words, and Pip made a sound of pure, unguarded joy and ran 3 full laps around the yard, which startled Blackwood Fortune into a brief and energetic display in his paddock. Bess eventually went back to the kettle. Alara eventually finished her tea. But the feed invoice stayed where it was on the table, unpaid for several hours more, which was the only outward sign that anything of significance had changed on this particular Thursday morning. Within a month, the work of preparing to receive the crown's horses began in serious earnest. The preparations were substantial. Additional stall space was required, and Alara arranged for a careful extension to be built, contracting the work with a local builder recommended by Croft, who turned out to be both efficient and reliable. New equipment was purchased. The feeding program was reviewed and updated. A second groom was hired, a young man named Arthur who came from a farming family and had grown up around horses and had a calm, steady manner that suited the daily demands of the work. Colonel Fairweather came to see the preparations underway and walked the extended stables with an expression of deep satisfaction. Over tea afterward, he told her he had written a personal note to Sir Reginald Brand, congratulating him on reaching the right decision. Did he reply? She asked. He said the choice had not been difficult, Fairweather said, which from Reginald Brand is very nearly a declaration of admiration. She allowed herself a small smile. The horses from the royal stable arrived in early summer, brought in 2 groups, each accompanied by a groom from the royal establishment, who would stay at Thornfield for a settling period to assist with the transition. There were 6 horses in total, and each one came with detailed documentation that was thorough in the way that official documentation tends to be, though Alara found it only slightly more comprehensive than her own records. She received each horse personally at the stable door, read the accompanying notes carefully, and made her own independent assessment. Sometimes her assessment confirmed the notes entirely. Sometimes she saw things the notes had missed. She was courteous about these differences, but she was clear about what she observed, because the horse's well-being was what mattered. The 2 that required the most immediate attention were a large stallion called Kaiser and a young mare named Clover, who had a lameness problem that had been troubling the royal stable for several months. Kaiser had a history. He had caused injury to 2 grooms during handling, not because he was genuinely dangerous by nature, but because he was a horse of exceptional intelligence and energy, who had been managed with too much force and not enough understanding. He had developed a set of responses to handling that were explosive and unpredictable. When notes warned about him at length, the royal groom who accompanied him kept a cautious distance and gave Alara a look that suggested he expected her to encounter exactly the same difficulties everyone else had. She did not go into Kaiser's stall on the first day. She stood at the door and looked at him. He looked back at her, with eyes that showed white at the edges, which told her about his current state clearly enough. She did not try to change it by force or by speed. She simply remained where she was until his breathing slowed slightly and the tension around his eyes reduced a fraction. Then she stepped back and walked away. This was her approach with him for the first several days. Presence without demand, proximity without pressure. The royal groom watched this from the corridor with visible skepticism. On the 4th day, Kaiser turned his head toward the stable door when he heard her footsteps in the corridor. She noticed. She did not make anything of it outwardly, but she noticed. On the 7th day, she entered his stall for the first time, moving quietly and giving him every second he needed, and he allowed it without any of the explosive response that had injured previous handlers. On the 14th day, he was accepting a halter without tension in his body. On the 21st day, Tom led him out to the yard, and he walked beside Tom with the composure of a horse who has found something steady enough to trust. The royal groom, watching this from the fence, was very quiet for a long time. Clover's lameness was a different challenge entirely. 3 veterinarians had examined her over the months prior to her arrival at Thornfield, and had not identified a clear cause for the recurring stiffness in her left foreleg. The notes described their findings and their treatments, none of which had produced any lasting improvement. She was a gentle-natured mare, and the persistent lameness was clearly causing her real discomfort, and the fact that no one had been able to resolve it was a source of genuine concern to those who cared for her. Alara spent considerable time simply watching Clover move. She asked the accompanying groom detailed questions about the mare's daily history, her routine, the surfaces she had been kept on, and the progression of shoeing decisions over the past year. She took notes on everything. Then she watched the mare move again. She requested that the farm's farrier come to conduct a fresh examination. When the farrier arrived and Alara explained what she wanted him to look at, they examined the shoeing together with Alara, asking specific, precise questions. They found it. A very slight imbalance in how the left foreshoe had been placed, not large enough on its own to have caught anyone's immediate attention, but consistent over many months, and affecting the angle at which Clover's foot met the ground with every stride. Multiplied across months of daily movement, it had created exactly the kind of recurring strain they were seeing. The farrier corrected the shoeing. Alara designed a careful and gradual rehabilitation program, beginning with short periods of movement on soft ground, and building by very small increments over the next 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, Clover was completely sound. A formal letter arrived from a senior official at the royal household. It expressed considerable warmth and thanked Alara for the care and expertise applied to the crown's horses. It mentioned Kaiser by name. It mentioned Clover by name. It said that reports from Thornfield had been received with great appreciation. Alara read it and filed it in the correspondence folder, in its correct chronological position, which was where it belonged alongside all the other evidence of what had been built here. She did allow herself, that evening, to walk out to the paddock after supper and stand at the fence for a while, watching the horses in the last of the summer light. Constance was grazing near the far end of the field with Promise beside her, bigger now, covering the ground with long, easy strides as he moved through the grass. Kaiser was in his stall but calm, which was itself a kind of miracle that had been built one patient day at a time. Clover was moving without any sign of hesitation. She had built this, every part of it, from a broken gate and 42 pounds, and a list made at a candle-lit table. She stood at the fence for a good while. The evening was warm. The horses were quiet. The brass plate on the front gate caught the last red light of the sun and held it. She went inside and made sure the morning's work was properly planned. There was always more to do. She had come to understand that this was not a burden, it was the whole point. In London, certain conversations traveled in ways that newspapers never captured. Not through formal announcements or published reports, but through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs and the particular kind of dinner table where the right people sat together and talked freely about things that mattered to them. The horse world was a small world in many ways, even among the wealthy and titled, and news from it moved quickly, once it had something worth moving for. Duke Aldrich Voss had not thought about Thornfield in some time. He had been occupied with his London life, which suited him considerably. He was a man of genuine social skill and steady ambition, and both of these qualities flourished in the city in ways they could never have in a Yorkshire farmyard. He was well placed in his circles, well regarded at his club, and his arrangement with the quietly charming and well-connected Lady Cecile Hartmore was proceeding in a direction that, when the time was right, would benefit both of them greatly. He had not thought much about Alara, either, which was not entirely comfortable when it did surface briefly in his mind. He told himself the arrangement had been practical, and that she was managing well enough where she was. He had given her the farm. She had somewhere to live. He had not been deliberately unkind, only realistic about the situation as it stood. This was the version of events he had constructed for himself, and he lived in it without particular difficulty. Until the dinner in Mayfair. He had been there on a Tuesday evening, at the home of a man whose name carried weight in both political and equestrian circles. There were perhaps 14 people around the long table, and the conversation had been moving through several topics with the smooth efficiency of people skilled at talking freely, while committing very firmly to almost nothing. Then one of the guests, a lord who had recently returned from touring properties in the north of England, mentioned Thornfield. He mentioned it in the way that genuinely impressed people mention things, which is a different tone entirely from polite conversation, and instantly recognizable to everyone present. He described the operation, the extraordinary standard of the horses, the quality of the facilities, the certified bloodlines, the royal warrant. He said it was the finest stud farm he had encountered in the north of England, possibly the finest he had seen anywhere in recent years. Someone at the table asked who was running it. The host, who knew more than the visiting lord, supplied the information in a calm, social tone. Lady Alara Voss, the Duke of Ashmont's wife. The table went still for approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds is not a long time, but at a dinner table among people who are paying attention, it is long enough for everyone to register something, and for all of them to look, without appearing to look, at the Duke. He felt it. He was too experienced in social situations not to feel it. He smiled. He said something brief and pleasant about how glad he was that the farm had found its way. He said it in a tone that positioned him as a generous figure somewhere in the background of the story, which was the only version he was willing to offer in public. The conversation moved on, as dinner table conversations always do. No one pursued the subject directly, but on the carriage ride home that night, Duke Aldrich sat in the dark with his hands folded and his thoughts moving in a direction he had not been expecting. He did not sleep well. In the morning he drafted a letter to Alara. He worked on it for considerably longer than he usually spent on any correspondence, which was itself a thing he would not have acknowledged. He wanted the tone exactly right, warm, but not so warm as to suggest he had been wrong in any of his decisions. Interested, but measured. The kind of letter a man might write if he had simply been very busy for a few years, and was now finding a moment to inquire after family matters. He mentioned that he might visit the country soon. He mentioned the phrase family business, which was chosen carefully to suggest purpose without revealing it. He had the letter sent from his club, out of a habit of privacy he had maintained for many years. Alara received it on a morning when the farm was in full operation. She was in the middle of a conversation with Arthur about the week's farrier visits, and Bess brought the letter from the post table with a look she used only for things she found deeply objectionable. Alara excused herself from the conversation, took the letter, and read it standing at the stable door. She recognized his handwriting immediately, and found that recognizing it immediately told her something useful about herself. She felt nothing particular. Not anger, not grief, not the hollow ache she had half expected might still be waiting somewhere. What she felt was a clear, alert practicality, the same feeling she had when reading a document that needed careful assessment rather than simple trust. She went inside and read it once more at the kitchen table. Then she went to find Bess, who was in the back kitchen and had clearly been waiting. "The Duke is considering a visit to the country," Alara said. Bess made a sound that was entirely unrepeatable in any polite setting. Alara nearly smiled. "Yes," she said, "exactly. I am going to write to Mr. Hughes." Mr. Hughes was her solicitor in town. She had first engaged him when the farm was barely a year old, because she had understood from the beginning that knowing her legal position precisely was not overcaution, but simply good sense. He was a compact, deliberate man who wore the same composed expression whether he was delivering good news or difficult news, and who had proved to be not only professionally excellent, but genuinely on her side, in a way that extended slightly beyond the strictly professional. She wrote him a full and detailed letter that same afternoon, explaining the situation clearly. She asked him to conduct a thorough review of every document, deed, and legal arrangement connected to Thornfield, the original transfer document, the deed itself, any conditions or reversionary clauses, every arrangement from the beginning. She wanted to know precisely and completely where she stood in law. He replied within the week. He would begin immediately. In the meantime, the farm continued to function with the steady purpose that had become its natural rhythm. Arthur and Pip worked well alongside each other, which was a genuine relief, because Pip's energy sometimes needed the counterweight of someone steadier. Tom continued his daily work, and Kaiser, who had now been at Thornfield for several months, was so transformed from the horse who had arrived with injury warnings in his documentation that the royal groom who had first delivered him would not have recognized the animal without a label. Fairweather visited, as he regularly did by now, moving through the farm with the ease of someone who had settled into the habit of the place. He used Thornfield as a convenient base during his northern travels, and he spent his time between his own affairs and conversations with Alara that ranged across horses and land management and the broader state of things in England, and occasionally across other subjects entirely. He had become, in the exact and genuine sense of the word, a friend. She had not been certain she would have room for friendship given how much of her energy went into the farm, but Fairweather was the kind of person who did not require your energy so much as your honesty, and she had plenty of that. He was at Thornfield on the Wednesday afternoon when Mr. Hughes came from town with his findings. Hughes arrived and arranged his papers on the kitchen table with the careful thoroughness of a man who had done his work completely and was now prepared to present it. He walked her through each document in order, explaining the relevant clauses and their implications in the plain language she had always appreciated in him. The conclusion was this: the deed of transfer, drawn up at the time of Alara's relocation to Thornfield by the Duke's own solicitor, had been prepared with a carelessness that was remarkable from a professional standpoint. There were several possible explanations for this carelessness, and Hughes was too professional to speculate about which one was correct. But the practical result was clear beyond any reasonable argument. The transfer was absolute and unconditional. There were no reversionary clauses, no conditions of maintenance, no mechanisms whatsoever by which the property could return to the Duke under any circumstances. He had signed Thornfield over to her completely and entirely. The Duke had intended to give her nothing of lasting value. He had given her everything. Hughes said this without any drama, in his level professional tone. He stacked the papers neatly and waited. Elara sat with this for a moment. Then she asked 2 questions. Was her legal position entirely secure, and were there any realistic circumstances under which it could be successfully challenged? Hughes said yes to the first, and essentially no to the second, with the qualification that any legal proceeding could theoretically be initiated by anyone, but that the legal position was so clearly and thoroughly documented that any such effort would be resolved quickly and completely in her favor. She nodded slowly. And the royal warrant? Hughes permitted himself a very small smile. Is held by you as the owner of the property, he said. In the event of any dispute about ownership, the warrant would be a rather significant complicating factor for anyone attempting to mount a claim. She sat with this too, turning it over in her thinking. Fairweather, who had been reading in the sitting room and had made no great pretense of not being curious about the meeting, appeared in the kitchen doorway when Hughes left. He looked at her face. Good meeting, he said. Very good, she said. She told him the substance of it. He listened without interruption, which was one of the things about him she valued most, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I do not believe he is coming to the country for the fresh air. No, she said, neither do I. Do you need anything from me? She thought carefully. Not yet, she said, but I may. He accepted this, and moved on to ask about Clover's recent movement assessment, which was what he genuinely wanted to discuss, and they spent the next half hour talking about the mare, which was where they were both most at home. Elara's reply to the Duke's letter arrived at his club 9 days after he had sent his own. It was 4 sentences long. It noted that she was well, and that the farm was in good health. It acknowledged his mention of a possible visit, without either inviting or discouraging one. It closed with a courtesy that was formally correct in every detail, and warm in none. The Duke read it 3 times. He was not entirely sure what he had expected, but it had not been this. It was the letter of a woman who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear from him, and the complete absence of anything in it that he could read as weakness or unspoken need made him feel something he could not quite name and did not particularly care to examine. He made inquiries. Through conversations at his club and through 1 or 2 more direct questions put to people who traveled north regularly, he began to build a clearer picture of Thornfield. What he built was not comfortable. The farm was not simply functioning. It was flourishing in a way that was being discussed openly by people whose opinions on such matters carried genuine weight. The royal warrant was not a rumor passed along by well-meaning country neighbors. It was a documented fact noted in the relevant London circles with considerable admiration. And the name attached to every part of this story was his wife's. His own name appeared in those conversations only as background, as explanation for how she had come to be in Yorkshire at all. He was the reason she had gone. He was not mentioned as a reason for anything else. He spoke to his solicitor about the property arrangement with more focus than he had previously brought to it. He had not thought carefully about the deed at the time, because he had not expected it to matter. He had expected the farm to struggle on quietly, or to fail entirely. He had not expected this. His solicitor reviewed the original documents and came back to him with a report, delivered in the careful, neutral tone of a professional who carries bad news but is too disciplined to say more than is necessary. The transfer was clean. There was nothing he could reasonably contest. The property was hers entirely. The Duke sat with this for longer than he was accustomed to sitting with any problem. Then, in the methodical way of a man who was not used to having no options whatsoever, he decided to go and see the situation for himself. He arranged his traveling party, which included 2 legal advisors, a man named Gerald Fitch who was senior and experienced, and a younger colleague named Henry Vane, who carried everything in a leather case and spoke only when addressed. The Duke wrote Alara a short note, informing her that he would be arriving at Thornfield in the 3rd week of October. He did not ask whether this was convenient. Alara received the note on a morning when she was reviewing the winter feed budget with Arthur, and she read it at the kitchen table, and then she folded it and set it down and finished the conversation about the feed budget, because the feed budget affected the horses and required her attention in a way that the Duke's intentions did not. That evening she wrote to Fairweather, informing him of the situation and asking whether he might arrange to be in Yorkshire during that period. She also sent word to Hughes, asking him to be at Thornfield on the morning of the Duke's arrival. She was going to be ready. Being ready was something she had taught herself in the years since she had arrived at this broken farm with a cane and a trunk and 42 pounds, and she had never once regretted the discipline of it. The 3rd week of October was 6 weeks away. She had work to do before it arrived. In the 6 weeks between the Duke's note and his arrival, Alara did not let a single morning pass without purpose. There was the feed budget to finalize, the quarterly accounts for her merchant clients in town, the schedule for winterizing the extended stable, and a detailed correspondence with the breed registry about a secondary bloodline inquiry connected to one of the boarding horses. None of these tasks waited simply because something personal was approaching. The farm did not wait, and so she did not wait either. Fairweather arrived 4 days before the Duke's expected date and settled into the guest room that Bess had long since made permanently ready for him. He came out to the stable yard on his first morning, as he always did, and walked the horses with Alara in the early light, and neither of them said anything about the Duke for nearly an hour. They talked about Kaiser, and about a mare whose spring foaling schedule needed adjusting, and about a young horse one of Fairweather's cavalry contacts had written to him about, seeking a recommendation for a reputable farm. Eventually he said, "You are remarkably settled for someone expecting an unwelcome visitor." She said, "He is not unwelcome. He is simply not important to the running of this farm." Fairweather considered this. "That distinction matters," he said. "It is the only distinction that matters," she said. Mr. Hughes came from town on the morning of the Duke's arrival, arriving at 7, which was 2 hours before the Duke's carriage was expected. He set his case on the kitchen table, arranged the documents in the order he intended to present them, accepted a cup of tea from Bess, and prepared himself in the composed and methodical way he did everything. Bess herself moved through the morning with a particular quality of precision that Alara had come to associate with situations where Bess had strong feelings she intended to express entirely through the excellence of her work. The kitchen was spotless. The hallway was swept. The good china had appeared on the kitchen shelf without anyone asking for it. The Duke's carriage came up the lane at 10 o'clock precisely, followed by a second smaller vehicle carrying his 2 legal advisors. They turned through the gate, and Alara watched them come from where she stood in the stable yard, straight-backed, her cane in her right hand, wearing her practical wool and her good boots, which was how she dressed when the farm was in full operation, which it was, because it was a Thursday, and on Thursdays the farm operated as it always did. Fairweather was near the stable door, apparently engaged in examining something on the post, which was a position from which one could see the entire yard without appearing to be watching it. Duke Aldrich stepped out of the carriage with the easy confidence he always carried in public situations, and for a moment he simply stood and looked at what surrounded him. He was not a man who showed much on his face, but what he saw required a moment of quiet adjustment. The stables were clean and solid. The paddocks were properly kept. The horses visible in the near field were clearly animals of quality, and the stone farmhouse that he had arranged to be placed in a dying condition as a convenient solution to an inconvenient situation was warm and well maintained and had window boxes with winter greenery on every sill. He came forward and greeted Alara with the social grace that had always been one of his genuine gifts. "Alara," he said, with warmth that was not entirely manufactured, "you look very well." "Thank you," she said. "You look exactly as I remember." This was not quite a compliment, and both of them knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it further. She invited him inside for tea. He accepted with the confident manner of a man who believes the tea is simply a prelude to productive conversation. What he found at the kitchen table was Mr. Hughes. He absorbed this without letting it show on his face. He sat down across from Hughes with the practiced ease of a man who has navigated unexpected complications in social settings many times, and he accepted the tea that Bess brought, with a formality that was entirely correct and contained nothing else whatsoever. Hughes opened his case without preamble. He explained the situation with precision. He produced the original deed of transfer and placed it on the table between them. He identified the relevant clauses, and more significantly, the relevant and complete absence of certain clauses that the Duke had clearly assumed would be present. He explained the legal position plainly and fully, in the same level tone he used for all professional communications. The Duke listened without interrupting. His hands, resting on the table, tightened at certain moments. Not visibly to anyone who was not paying careful attention. Ilara was paying careful attention. When Hughes finished, the Duke said, "I see." He said it in the measured tone of a man, working through his remaining options methodically. Hughes said there was one further matter. He produced a second document, which he described as a formal notice that Lady Voss would be requesting a legal separation, to which she was fully entitled under the circumstances, and the preliminary steps had already been initiated. He set this document on the table beside the first. The Duke looked at this second document for a longer moment than he had given the first. He called Gerald Fitch inside from the yard. Fitch reviewed the deed and the transfer documents with the unhurried thoroughness of an experienced professional who recognizes poor legal drafting when he sees it clearly laid out. He bent close to the Duke and spoke quietly for several minutes, and the substance of what he said was clearly not what the Duke had traveled 300 miles to hear. The Duke sat back. He looked at Ilara. She was sitting across the table from him, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she looked at him with the clear, settled gaze of a woman who had absolutely nothing to fear from him, and had known this with certainty before his carriage turned through her gate. He said, after a measured pause, "You have been busy." "I have," she said. He said, "The farm looks very well." "It is well," she said. There was a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite hostile. It was the silence of two people who had once shared a life and now shared nothing in this room, except the legal documents on the table between them, and both of them understood this precisely. He said, "I suppose congratulations are in order. For the royal warrant." "Thank you," she said. Another silence settled between them. He looked around the kitchen, which Bess kept clean and warm, and which smelled of wood polish and something good from the range, and which was entirely Ilara's, in every detail, and not his, in any way at all. He said he would need to speak further with his legal team before anything additional was discussed. Ilara said of course. He was not unpleasant about any of it, because he was never unpleasant in situations where pleasantness cost him nothing. He went back to the yard and stood with Fitch and Vane beside the second carriage, their voices low, for a considerable time. The Duke's face during this conversation was the face of a man who was working privately through something very difficult, while maintaining the public appearance of a man doing something routine. Fairweather had long since moved away from the stable door. He had gone inside, and Ilara had gone inside with him, and they sat together in the kitchen while the conversation in the yard proceeded. Fairweather poured himself more tea and asked Ilara how she was holding up. "Quite well," she said, "better than I would have expected." "It is not surprising," he said. "You prepared." "I have been preparing for 3 years," she said, "without knowing precisely what I was preparing for." He looked at her with the expression he sometimes had when she said something that confirmed an opinion he already held. "That is the best kind of preparation," he said, "the kind that is useful for whatever arrives." She thought he was right about this, and they finished their tea in companionable quiet. An hour later the Duke came back inside alone. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and for a moment, without the papers between them, and without the advisors present, it was almost as though it were simply two people having a plain conversation. He said he had no intention of contesting any part of the legal position. She said she had not expected that he would. He said he understood that the situation had resolved itself in a way that was clear and final. She said yes, it had. He said, and here, his tone shifted into something that was not quite an apology, but lived very close to one, that he hoped she understood. He had not imagined things would resolve themselves quite this way. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "What did you imagine?" He did not answer immediately. When he did, he said he had imagined she would struggle more than she had. She nodded slowly, considering this. "And what were you planning to do about the struggling?" she said. He had no answer for this. She had not truly expected one. She said, gently and plainly, that she had no interest in a drawn-out process of any kind. She wanted the separation conducted cleanly and with proper legal documentation. She made no claims on his London properties or his income, because she required nothing from him. She wanted only what was already established as hers, and what was established as hers was considerable. He looked at her one more time, and she thought he was perhaps seeing her clearly for the first time in all the years he had known her, and that what he saw was very different from what he had married, and very different from what he had placed in a carriage to Yorkshire without saying goodbye. He said he would instruct Fitch to cooperate fully with Mr. Hughes. She said, "Thank you." He left before lunch. The two carriages went back down the lane and passed through the gate, and Alara stood in the stable yard and watched them go. Bess came and stood beside her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Then Bess said, "He did not even look at the horses." Alara considered this. "No," she said, "he never did." They went back inside. There was a feed invoice to review, and a letter from the breed registry to answer, and Arthur had a question about the winter bedding schedule that she had been meaning to address since early morning. The day continued as it always did, with the work that needed doing. She did not celebrate. The moment did not call for celebration. What it called for was something quieter and more complete than that. She felt the particular sense of a chapter that has been left half open for a long time, being finally and thoroughly closed. Not with violence or with noise. Just closed, the way you close the door on a room you have been walking past for years and have now simply finished with. She went to check on Clover before supper, because the mare had shown a slightly different stride that morning, and Alara wanted to observe her again in the evening light. Clover was entirely fine. She pressed her nose briefly against Alara's shoulder, which was a habit she had developed, and Alara stood with her for a few quiet minutes, and let the particular peace of the stable settle around her. It was a good peace, the peace of a place that was healthy and purposeful, and entirely hers. She walked back to the farmhouse in the dark with her lantern and her cane, and went inside to the warmth and the light, and Bess had made supper, and Pip was already at the table eating because he was always hungry, and Tom was washing up at the back basin, and Fairweather was in the chair by the fire with a book open on his knee. She sat down. She ate supper. She listened to Pip tell a story about something that had happened that afternoon with Arthur and one of the boarding horses, a small incident that had become considerably funnier than it probably needed to be in the retelling, and she found herself laughing properly and freely for the first time in days. Fairweather looked up from his book and watched her with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been hoping for a specific thing and has just seen it arrive. In the months after the Duke's visit, Thornfield entered what Alara would later look back on as its period of deepest and most complete peace. Not because the work was lighter. It was, if anything, heavier, because the reputation of the farm was drawing more attention and more horses and more responsibility with every season that passed. But the work no longer existed alongside an unresolved uncertainty about her place in it. The last uncertain thing in her legal and personal situation had been settled, and the clarity of that made everything she did feel more fully and more permanently hers. The Duke had been as good as his word in the one respect she had asked for. Fitch cooperated with Hughes, and the legal separation was processed without drama or complication, which was all she had required. She did not follow the Duke's subsequent movements, or inquire about Lady Cecile Hartmore, or any of the rest of his London life. She knew, because information moves through channels that cannot entirely be stopped, that he remained in London, and that his life there continued along its established course. She did not find this interesting in any way. What she found interesting was the foal that Constance produced in the spring of that year, a gray filly with legs so clean and so long that Tom stood looking at her for 5 full minutes without speaking, which was longer than he usually maintained silence, even in the presence of genuinely exceptional animals. Alara named her Perseverance. Pip shortened it immediately to Percy, which was perhaps not ideally suited to a filly, but stuck immediately and stayed. Percy showed, from her earliest days, qualities that went beyond what even Constance's proven bloodline might have fully predicted. She was calm in situations that made other young horses anxious. She learned quickly and without resistance. Her movement at liberty was so expressive and so free that even the most businesslike visitors to the farm stopped their conversations and simply watched her. Tom watched her move one morning and said nothing for a very long time, and then said, "That one knows something the rest of them are still working out." Ilara did not hurry Percy's future. She planned it carefully, because careful planning was what she did with every living thing in her care. She had learned, perhaps more than any other lesson in her years at Thornfield, that patience produced better results than urgency in almost every situation she had ever encountered. The winter that year was harder than the previous two, with cold that arrived early and stayed late, and required the entire farm to adapt its routine in multiple ways. Fuel costs rose. The heating of the extended stable required its own management plan. Ilara worked through the budget adjustments over several evenings at her desk, shifting allocations and renegotiating costs where she could, and she arrived at a solution that maintained the full standard of care for every animal, without placing the farm's financial position under genuine pressure. This was the kind of problem she had been solving since the beginning, and she solved it the same way she always had, by thinking it through completely before she moved. Croft came to see her in January and told her that 2 neighboring merchants had asked about her independently, seeking her advice on their accounts. He asked, carefully and without pressure, whether she would consider taking on a small number of additional clients for bookkeeping and financial management. The income would be modest but consistent, and the work would not be significant for someone with her established skills. She considered it for a full day and then said yes, with clear conditions about the time required and the scope she would accept. By February, she had 3 new clients. By April, she had 5. She ran this work with the same precision she applied to everything else, and the word moved through the merchant community that Lady Voss's accounts were always accurate, always on time, and always came with a brief plain note explaining anything unusual. Her existing work at the farm never suffered for it, because she organized her time with the same quality of attention she brought to organizing the stables. None of this was what she had imagined her life would be when she was a young girl, reading about London seasons and suitable marriages. She thought about this occasionally, not with sadness but with the somewhat surprised interest of someone who has discovered that the life she did not choose suits her considerably better than the life she was supposed to have wanted. Fairweather visited twice more that spring, and their conversations had settled into the easy rhythm of 2 people who know each other well enough to be honest, without being careful about every word. He told her things about his own past that he told very few people. She told him things about hers with a freedom she had not had since she was very young. Before speaking, her thoughts had been trained out of her in the usual way of her upbringing. He asked her once about the letters she received occasionally from a horse trainer in the south of England named Charles Whitmore. She looked at him with some amusement. "How do you know about those?" "Bess mentioned he writes regularly," Fairweather said. "I may have noticed his name on a few envelopes on the hall table." She told him, without particular embellishment, that Whitmore was a professional contact who had first written to her 2 years ago about a technical question relating to a bloodline registration, and whose correspondence had become, over time, something more than professional. He was a thoughtful man, well regarded in his field, and his letters were intelligent and considered, and occasionally made her laugh when she had not expected to. She told him Whitmore was a widower with 1 grown daughter living in London, and that he lived in Hampshire with 2 horses and a large library, and a housekeeper who, from his descriptions, was a formidable woman who kept him organized and well fed. "And you write back," Fairweather said. "I write back," she said. He made no further comment, but his expression was the expression of someone who finds a piece of information satisfying and is choosing not to say so aloud, which with Fairweather was itself a form of comment. Whitmore had first heard about Ilara through the breed registry announcement regarding Constance's bloodline certification, which had been a notable event in that professional world. He had written initially about a specific technical aspect of the documentation, and she had answered precisely and completely. And he had written back not strictly about the documentation, but about the subject of Meridian's bloodline in its broader historical context, which she had found genuinely interesting, and the exchange had continued from there, without either of them making a particular point of continuing it. It simply continued because each letter produced a reason for another. He asked her questions that were not easy questions, not merely about horses, but about the decisions she had made and her reasons for them, and his questions showed clearly that he had read her previous answers with real attention, which she appreciated more than she could have easily articulated to anyone. She did not know what would come of it. She did not need to know yet. She had learned to trust the process of things developing at the pace they needed, and she applied this principle to every part of her life, with consistent and satisfying results. Pip came to her in early summer with a question she had been expecting. He wanted to know whether she would support him in pursuing formal training at an established equestrian academy in the north, which would build on everything he had learned at Thornfield and give him recognized credentials that would open wider doors in the professional horse world. She said yes before he finished asking, which startled him. She told him she had been setting aside a portion of the farm's income for this specific purpose for a year and a half. She had not mentioned it because she had wanted the initiative to come from him rather than from her suggesting it to him. He stared at her for a full moment. She said, "Close your mouth, Pip. There is work this afternoon." He spent the rest of that morning in a quiet state of being, genuinely overwhelmed, and the afternoon working harder than usual, which she noticed and said nothing about, because he deserved the dignity of his own feelings on the subject. Arthur was growing into an excellent groom in his own right, more methodical than Pip and steadier in the daily rhythm of the farm's routine, which complemented what the operation needed very well. Tom worked alongside them both, without creating unnecessary hierarchy between them, which was a management skill Elara recognized as rare and valuable, and she told him so plainly. The autumn of that year brought a new and unexpected development, an inquiry from a landowner 3 counties away who had heard about Thornfield through Lord Pembury and wanted to discuss a breeding arrangement for 2 mares. The distance involved made the usual arrangement impractical, and he asked whether she would be willing to travel south to assess the animals at his property before any agreement was formalized. She had never done this before. She thought about it carefully and said yes, because the inquiry came through Pembury, whose judgment she trusted, and because the mares were, from the description she received, potentially valuable enough to make the arrangement worth the effort. She traveled south in November with Tom, leaving Arthur in charge of the farm, with Pip assisting during a break from the academy. And what she found at the southern property was interesting for professional reasons, and significant for another reason she had not anticipated. Charles Whitmore was a friend of the landowner. He was at the property when she arrived. They had exchanged letters for 2 years without meeting, and the meeting, when it came without announcement or preparation, was simply and thoroughly honest. He was quieter in person than she had imagined from his letters, and she was perhaps more direct than the careful tone of her written correspondence had fully prepared him for. They spent 3 days at the property in the company of the landowner and his horses and several other guests, with the particular awareness of 2 people who have come to know each other well in writing and are now discovering what the other dimension of knowing someone yields. What it yielded, she thought on the carriage ride north, was something that deserved to be treated carefully, not with urgency, not with any assumptions, but with care. She put his most recent letter on the mantelpiece when she returned to Thornfield, which was not where she put letters requiring an answer, and not where she put letters that were simply filed. Bess noticed this without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. Tom asked, in the straightforward way he asked everything, how the southern trip had gone. "Very well," she said, "professionally and in other respects." He nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had already worked out for himself, which was probably the case. She sat down at her desk that evening, intending to write several letters, of which Whitmore's was one, and found that his was the letter she wrote first and wrote longest, and which she revised more carefully than she usually revised anything before she was satisfied with what she had put down. She sealed it and left it in the post tray for the morning. Then she worked on the feed budget and the breed registry correspondence and the accounts for her town clients. By the time Bess knocked on the door to say it was past midnight and the fire had burned low, she had finished all of it. She had also started something she had not planned to start that evening, a set of notes about the principles she had developed in her work with difficult horses over the past several years, written down in organized form for the first time. She had been carrying these principles in her head and in her practice for a long time, and she had never written them down together in any structured way. She did not know yet what these notes were for. She only knew it felt important to write them. She put them in the right-hand drawer of her desk, which was where she kept things that mattered and were not yet finished. Then she blew out the candle and went to bed, and lay in the dark for a few minutes listening to the sounds of the farm at night, which were sounds she knew better now than any sounds she had known anywhere in her life, and which told her every time she heard them that everything was as it should be. By the following spring, 2 years after the Duke's visit, and 3 full years since the royal warrant had been awarded, things had changed again at Thornfield, and they had changed in the particular way that things change when a foundation has been laid, with enough patience and care, that what is built on top of it simply holds. Not dramatically, not in any way that surprised anyone who had been watching from close enough, but definitively, in the way that permanent things become permanent by the plain accumulation of their own evidence. The farm now managed 10 horses of its own, in addition to the 6 royal horses and 4 boarders. The extended stable was fully operational and maintained, with the precision that had become the standard for every part of Thornfield. A second small cottage had been built on the property, and was occupied by Arthur, who had proved so steady and so committed over the years, that Alara had offered him a permanent position with accommodation, and he had accepted without a moment's hesitation. Pip returned from the academy at regular intervals during his program, arriving each time with new technical knowledge and new questions that he immediately tested against everything he had learned at the farm. The conversations between him and Alara and Tom during these visits had a quality that Fairweather, who was present for one of them, described afterward as the finest informal education in horsemanship he had witnessed in 40 years of being around people who knew horses seriously. He meant it, and the 3 of them knew he meant it, which made Pip stand slightly straighter, and made Tom look at the middle distance with an expression that meant he was pleased. The journalist arrived on a Tuesday in April. His name was William Bassett, and he wrote for the Illustrated London News, and he came with a letter of introduction and an illustrator named Edmund Clay, who traveled with him and carried a leather satchel filled with drawing tools. Bassett was perhaps 28, with an observant manner and the slightly careful approach of a man who has been told he is being given access to something significant and wants to be worthy of it. He had been assigned to write a feature on exceptional English equestrian establishments, and Thornfield had been named independently by 3 separate sources, all of them well regarded in the horse world, as a subject that could not reasonably be omitted. Alara agreed to the visit because Fairweather had counseled her to consider it, and because she had come over the years to trust his judgment in areas where her own experience was still forming. She set her terms clearly before she agreed: full access to the farm and to the horses, honest answers to honest questions. She would not arrange anything artificially or perform for the illustrator. Whatever they saw would be exactly what the farm was on any ordinary working day. Bassett agreed to these terms with the evident relief of a professional who has spent time with subjects who operate under different principles. He spent 3 full days at Thornfield. On the first day he walked the stables with Alara, who answered every question directly and without any of the self-promotion he was accustomed to from people who had built something they were proud of. He noted this in the way that experienced writers note things that are different from the usual pattern. He watched Tom work with Kaiser, and afterward, privately, he asked Alara whether she was certain this was the same horse described in the royal stable's original documentation. She produced the records and let him read them, and he was quiet for a considerable time after. On the second day he watched Pip work with the young horses during one of Pip's visits from the academy, and asked Pip about his background, and Pip told him in the same direct and unembellished way he told everything, including the detail about sleeping in the stable stall when he first arrived at Thornfield as a hungry boy without anywhere to go. Bassett wrote in his notebook for a long time after that conversation. Edmund Clay drew constantly through both days. He drew the horses in the paddocks and the grooms at their work, and the yard in the clear morning light, and the farmhouse in the warm late afternoon. He drew Alara at the paddock fence, watching Promise move across the far end of the field, and the drawing, which she saw later reproduced as a print in the article, captured something precise and true about her posture and the quality of her attention that she found she recognized completely, which she had not quite expected from a drawing of herself. On the second evening, Bassett asked whether she would speak about the full history of the farm, including how she had come to be there. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would answer what he asked, and he could decide for himself what was relevant to his article. He asked carefully, and she answered plainly, and the conversation covered ground she had not spoken about to many people: the accident, the Duke's decision, the carriage to Yorkshire, the broken gate, the 42 pounds. She did not present any of it with bitterness, or with the particular kind of drama that asks its listener to feel something prescribed. She presented it as facts, because they were facts. And the facts led in a clear and unbroken line to everything the farm had become. Bassett wrote without interrupting. When she finished, he looked up from his notebook and said, "You are not angry." She considered this properly. "I was, early on," she said, "but anger is expensive. I had other things to spend on." He wrote this down as well. She did not see the article before it was published, because that had not been part of the agreement. What arrived on a Friday morning in early May, in the regular post, tucked between two ordinary pieces of correspondence, was a copy of the Illustrated London News. Bess brought it to the kitchen table and set it there with great deliberateness, and then moved a few feet away and found something to do that allowed her to watch. Alara opened it. She found the feature inside. The headline read, "From Ruin to Royal, How Lady Alara Voss Raised a Kingdom in the Fields She Was Left to Die In." She read the article twice through. It was long, 3 full pages, with Edmund Clay's illustrations placed throughout. The stable yard drawing was there, and the drawing of the horses in the paddock, and the careful portrait of Alara at the fence. The writing was clear and precise, and treated the subject with respect, and it was without the sentimentality that she would have found uncomfortable. The article told the essential truth, not every detail, because no article can hold every detail of a life, but the shape of it was right. She had arrived at a broken and indebted farm with nothing, and she had built something extraordinary through intelligence and patience and unrelenting work, and the evidence of this was not claimed but documented and recognized at the highest level in the country. The Duke's name appeared once, in the 5th paragraph, describing the circumstances of her arrival in Yorkshire. It appeared without additional comment, which was in itself the most complete comment possible. Bess came and sat down across from her, which was something Bess did only in moments that required it, and read the article herself, moving her lips very slightly as she did. When she finished, she closed the publication and placed both hands flat on the table and said, "Right then." This was, Alara thought, the most satisfying review the article could possibly have received. The responses began arriving within 2 weeks. Letters from people she had never met, from across England, who had read the feature and wished to express admiration or ask questions, or inquire about boarding arrangements or breeding consultations. Letters from people in the professional equestrian world, who had known of Thornfield through their own channels, and wanted to establish direct contact. A formal note from a senior member of the royal household expressing congratulations. Letters also came from people connected to the veterinary world, interested in her approach to Clover's lameness diagnosis, and to the rehabilitation method she had developed and applied. One came from a retired cavalry officer who had read the account of Kaiser's transformation, and wrote that it aligned precisely with approaches he had long believed should be applied more widely in the cavalry's own horse management. He asked whether she might be willing to correspond further about it. She wrote back to all of them. She answered every letter personally, because if a person had taken the time to write with a genuine question, she owed them a genuine answer. This had been her practice since the beginning. It did not change now. One letter came from Charles Whitmore, written in Hampshire, longer than usual and more personal than anything he had previously put on paper. He said that reading the article had made him feel, in a way he found genuinely difficult to express precisely, something like pride, though he understood that pride was not quite the right word given that he had contributed nothing to what she had built. He said perhaps what he felt was the thing that happens when you have come to understand someone clearly through their words and their thinking, and then you see the full account of what they have done, and the account confirms not just the facts you already knew, but the entire quality of the person behind the facts. She read this letter in the evening, sitting at the kitchen table, with the last of the day's light coming in through the window that had been repaired and cleaned and kept properly for years now, through every season since she had first arrived, to find it boarded up with warped planks in the rain. She read it once, and then she sat with it for a while, and then she read it once more. Then she began to write back. The letter she wrote was longer than usual, and personal, in a way that was new. She did not plan it carefully, or revise it excessively. She simply wrote what was true, which was what she did with everything when she was doing it as it should be done. She sealed it, and put it in the post tray for the morning. She blew out the candle and went to bed. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds of the farm at night, the occasional movement of a horse in a stall, the distant call of an owl somewhere over the back paddocks, the particular settling sounds of the old farmhouse around her. These were the sounds she knew best in the world now. They were the sounds of a life that was entirely hers, that no one had given her, and no one could take away. She thought about what she had told Bassett. Anger is expensive. I had other things to spend on. She had spent on Constance, and on Promise, and on Percy, and on Kaiser, and on Clover, and on Pip, and on Tom, and on the books and the records, and the brass plate on the gate. She had spent on Bess's proper salary, and on Arthur's cottage, and on the feed budget, and on Croft's accounts managed carefully through every season. She had spent on every cold morning, and every difficult horse, and every patient hour, that had turned this ruined place into what it now was. She had spent well. The evidence of this was outside in the dark, around her, breathing quietly. She slept. The summer that followed was a good one in every measurable way. The weather was generous, which mattered practically for the animals and the land. The farm operated with the efficient and confident rhythm of a place that has thoroughly found its proper pace. The 10 horses of the farm were in excellent condition. The royal horses were in excellent condition. Clover moved with a complete and unimpeded freedom that still gave Alara a particular quiet satisfaction every time she watched her go. Kaiser had become, against every expectation held by anyone who had known him before, a horse that visiting grooms were brought to observe as an example of what good, patient handling could accomplish when applied with real consistency. Pip came home from the academy in July to help through the busiest stretch of the summer, and arrived with a confidence and a formal vocabulary of equestrian training that enriched every conversation he entered. He and Tom, working together in the yard, had become one of the most reliable and worthwhile sights on the farm. The old man and the young one, different in nearly everything, except their absolute and growing understanding of horses, which was precise and committed and developing on both sides. Arthur had settled into Thornfield so completely that it was genuinely difficult to reconstruct what the daily routine had looked like before he was part of it. He was not a man who required much conversation, but he was consistent and trustworthy in the management of his daily responsibilities, and every horse in his care was always correct. Croft came less frequently now than he had in the early years, because the formal arrangement between them had shifted over time into something less transactional and more collegial, and the merchant accounts she managed for him were stable enough not to require constant consultation. But he still appeared on the last Wednesday of each month and sat at the kitchen table with his tea, and his visits had taken on the character of something that had started as a financial arrangement and had become, without either of them quite deciding it should, a friendship. He was there on the Wednesday when the second letter from the London publisher arrived. The first letter had come in June, from an editor at a firm that produced a respected series of books on English country life and its particular forms of expertise, written by people with direct and deep practical experience of their subjects. The editor had read the article in the Illustrated London News and had written to ask whether Lady Voss had ever considered writing about her work. She had not considered it before the letter arrived, but she had found herself thinking about it for several days after, in the way she thought about things she was not yet certain of, quietly, persistently, from more than one angle, without forcing a conclusion before it was ready. She had thought about the notes she had written down in her desk drawer months ago, the organized account of the principles she had developed. She had taken them out and read through them again, and found they were more complete and more useful than she had remembered. She had written back to the editor to say she was considering his inquiry seriously. The second letter from him now asked whether she might be willing to meet, either in London or at the farm, to discuss the project in more detail. Croft, reading this over her shoulder, in the direct way that old friends of a certain comfortable familiarity sometimes do, said, "Well, are you going to write it?" She said she did not know yet. He said, "You have been writing things down for years. You have your notes, you have records and methods, and more to say about horses than most people who have already written books about horses." She said, "That is not the same as writing a book." He said, "You have done harder things than writing." This was an argument she could not easily answer, so she set the letter aside to consider, and returned the conversation to his accounts, which needed her full attention for the rest of the afternoon. But she thought about it. She thought about it seriously, in the way she gave serious attention to every decision that had the potential to matter. Charles Whitmore traveled north in September. The visit had been discussed in correspondence and had been planned with the deliberate care of two people who understood that what they were doing was not casual. He arrived on a Monday afternoon in a hired carriage and stood in the yard, looking at Thornfield, with the particular quality of attention that people gave the farm when they saw it for the first time in person. The expression of someone taking in the gap between what they had imagined from description and what they were actually standing in front of. Bess received him at the door with the formal correctness that, in Bess's particular language, indicated she had already formed a favorable opinion and was choosing to express this through the quality of her welcome rather than through any words about it. He stayed for 4 days. He was not there to discuss horses exclusively, though they discussed horses a great deal, because it was the language they both knew best, and their conversations about horses were always also conversations about something else, about patience and judgment, and what it means to read something or someone carefully before you respond. He walked the farm with her in the mornings at her pace, which he did without adjusting his manner or drawing any attention to the accommodation, and she noticed this and said nothing about it, because there was nothing that needed saying. He talked with Tom one afternoon, and Tom's expression during their conversation was the settled and engaged expression he had when someone had said something worth responding to. He was interested in Pip's progress and asked questions about it that showed he had read what Alara had written about the boy in her letters and had paid genuine attention to it. On the third evening, sitting in the kitchen with the autumn dark beyond the windows and the fire going well, he asked her what she saw for the farm in the years ahead. She told him, more horses, more careful and deliberate breeding, the book she was probably going to write, Pip returning permanently when his formal training was complete, Tom working for as long as he wished to and living here when he no longer did, a farm that was not only a place of good commerce, but a place of real and transmissible knowledge, where the understanding of horses and their care was practiced and deepened and passed forward to the people who came after. He listened to all of this without interrupting once. Then he said, with care, and with the directness she had come to appreciate as one of his defining qualities, that he had been thinking about his own future as well, about whether the future he was moving toward might have a shape that included considerably more of Yorkshire than his current arrangement in Hampshire provided. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the firelight. He said he was not suggesting anything immediate or assumed. He was simply a man who believed in being honest about where his thinking had arrived, and where it had arrived was in the direction of the north, with a degree of conviction that surprised even him. She was quiet for a moment, because the moment warranted it. She said she appreciated honesty in all things, which he already knew, and that what he had said deserved a response that was equally honest. He said, "Then give me one." She said that her own thinking had arrived at a particular place as well, and that the place it had arrived was not opposed to his. She said she believed that if two people were as careful with horses as they both were, they ought to be at least as careful with each other, which meant not rushing, and not assuming, and doing the thing that she had learned was the foundation of everything she had ever built that was worth keeping, paying proper attention. He said that seemed exactly right to him. They sat with that for a while. The fire settled. From the direction of the stable, the faint sound of a horse shifting in its stall reached them through the wall. The comfortable sound of an animal at rest in a place where it was well cared for. It was a good evening. One of the genuinely good ones that a life, if it has been built with enough patience and enough honesty, eventually begins to produce with some regularity. He left on a Friday morning, and the yard was in full operation with its usual weekday activity, and his departure was practical and uncomplicated, because they were both people who found unnecessary sentiment a poor substitute for the real thing. He shook Tom's hand, and Tom's response to this was a nod that contained considerably more than it showed. He said something to Pip that made the young man laugh, and then look surprised at himself for laughing. He thanked Bess for the accommodation and the cooking, and Bess said she hoped he would come back soon, which was the clearest endorsement she could give anyone without departing from her own character. He said goodbye to Alara at the gate beside the brass plate, in the way of people who are parting, without any real uncertainty about the fact that they will see each other again shortly. She watched the carriage go down the lane and turn out through the gate. Then she turned back to the yard. She stopped at the fence of the paddock where Percy was grazing. The The gray filly was past 2 now, and her development had continued to be exceptional in every respect. She raised her head when Alara stopped at the fence, and they looked at each other in the quiet and mutual way that had developed between them over months of daily proximity. Alara thought about the book. She thought about what Croft had said so straightforwardly. You have done harder things. She thought about the notes in the desk drawer, the principles she had written down because they needed to exist somewhere outside her own head. She thought about the question Bassett had asked her the evening of their conversation, the question that had surprised her by arriving so simply and so directly. You are not angry. Anger is expensive. I had other things to spend on. She pushed off from the fence and walked to the farmhouse. She opened the desk drawer and took out the notes she had written. She read through them from the beginning, slowly, and with the full attention she gave everything that mattered. Then she found a clean sheet of paper. At the top of it she wrote, The Patient Hand. Notes on the Care and Understanding of Horses, by Lady Alara Voss, Thornfield Stud Farm, Yorkshire. She read what she had written. Then she put down her pen, because there was something she needed to check in the stable before she settled in to start. A young boarding horse had been showing a slight stiffness in the mornings that she wanted to observe again before she decided what it meant. She always started with the horses. That had been true from the first morning at Thornfield, when she had gone to the stables before she went inside to assess the damage to the farmhouse. It remained true now, and she did not expect it to change. 2 more years passed, and in that time Thornfield became something it had not set out to be. It had set out, in Alara's own quiet accounting of the thing, to survive. Then it had become a place that flourished. Then it had become a royal warrant farm. And then, in the years that followed all of that, it became something harder to put into a single word. A place that people traveled to see, not only for the standard of the horses, but for what the place itself had come to represent. Not every farm that achieves commercial success or royal recognition reaches this further thing. It requires, beyond the standard of the work itself, a quality in the people doing the work that communicates through the work and then through the stories told about the work, and eventually becomes part of what the place means in the world. Thornfield had this quality, and it had it because Alara had it, and because she had gathered around her people who recognized it and reflected it back in everything they did. The book was published in October, 18 months after she had written its title, at the top of a clean sheet of paper at her kitchen desk. The Patient Hand, Notes on the Care and Understanding of Horses, was not a long book. It was precise and practical, and written in the same clear, undecorated language that Alara brought to every form of communication she engaged in. It described the principles she had developed and tested over 7 years at Thornfield, the approaches to handling and assessment and rehabilitation and breeding that had produced the results the farm was known for. It included detailed sections on reading equine behavior with accuracy, on managing specific conditions through careful and gradual method, on the relationship between consistency in handling and long-term outcomes in health and performance. It described the work with Kaiser in a full chapter, from first observation to the morning Tom led him across the yard, as a calm and cooperative horse. It described Clover's lameness in another, from the initial assessment through the shoeing correction, and the 6 weeks of precise rehabilitation that followed. The publisher had expected it to sell modestly among specialists. It sold, within its first 3 months, to 2,000 buyers across England. By the following spring, it was being read and discussed in veterinary circles, in breeding circles, and within the cavalry establishment, where several senior officers had acquired copies and were circulating them through their commands. A second edition was requested before summer. Alara received this news on a morning when she was checking the winter supply records with Arthur, and she absorbed it, nodded once, and returned to the supply records. Arthur, who had by that point learned to read her responses with considerable accuracy, understood from this that she was genuinely pleased. The breed registry sent a formal representative to Thornfield that autumn to discuss the possibility of Alara contributing to a professional review of registration practices, specifically regarding the handling of bloodline documentation in cases where historical records were incomplete or had been improperly processed. Her work on Constance's case had become a reference point in the registry community, and the practical approach she had taken, systematic, painstaking, built from verifiable evidence rather than assumption, was considered a model for how such cases ought to be handled. She agreed to contribute. The additional correspondence this generated added to her working life but did not displace anything, because she had become over the years extremely efficient with her time. She managed this efficiency the same way she managed everything, by thinking clearly about what mattered, and giving her attention to those things first. Pip returned to Thornfield permanently in the spring of that year, completing the arc of something that had begun in a stable stall with a hungry boy, who had been asked whether he wanted to eat. He came back with a formal qualification from the academy, a confidence that was not arrogance but the settled certainty of someone who genuinely knows their work, and a way of moving around horses that Tom, observing it, described in 3 words as simply right. He took the formal title of stable manager, which was now entirely appropriate to what the role had grown into, and the transition of responsibility between him and Tom and Ilara was handled with the naturalness of something long prepared for that, simply arrives when the time is correct. Tom, who was past 65 and had been working at a reduced pace for 2 years, without anyone remarking on it in any pointed way, decided that spring that he was ready for the next arrangement. He moved to the cottage that Ilara had built for his use, and which had stood ready for this moment, and he began to occupy his time in the way of a man who has done his full work and now has the right to do what he pleases. What pleased him, most mornings, was to walk to the paddock fence and spend an hour watching the horses. Ilara joined him sometimes, standing beside him in the early quiet, and they said very little, because they did not need to. She had arranged a proper income for Tom that required no further work from him, and would continue for as long as he chose to remain at Thornfield, because he had given her something that could not be repaid in full, but could at least be acknowledged with some proportion to its value. He accepted this in the way he accepted things that moved him, without much comment, but with the settled expression of someone who has been treated with the respect they deserved and recognizes it. Charles Whitmore had moved to Yorkshire by the end of that same year. He took a property 4 miles from Thornfield, with land enough for a few horses and space enough for his considerable library, and established himself there, with the practical competence of a man who knows how to build a life in a new place. The distance between the 2 properties was enough to give both of them the independence that was essential to who they each were, and close enough to make regular connections simple and easy. What the arrangement represented, without being labeled as any particular formal category, was clear to both of them, and clear to everyone around them, and no one who observed it closely found it anything other than exactly right for the 2 people involved. Bess had a great deal to say about Charles Whitmore, all of it favorable, expressed in the direct and uninhibited way she said everything she meant. Fairweather, on one of his visits, encountered Whitmore at the kitchen table, and the 2 men spent an hour talking about horses, with the immediate recognition of people who share a language and have been given an unexpected occasion to use it together. Afterward, walking the stable yard with Ilara, Fairweather said only, "He suits you." She said she thought he did. Pip, now a grown man, with a formal title, and a growing reputation of his own in the northern equestrian world, began giving his first occasional lessons to riders brought to Thornfield for that purpose. In every conversation about his background and his training that anyone ever drew him into, he credited Thornfield first, and Lady Voss specifically and completely, and he did this not as a courtesy, but as a straightforward statement of a fact he considered too important to leave unstated. The second edition of the book arrived in its first delivery on a clear morning in late September, when the early autumn light was doing the thing it does in that season, making everything appear slightly more deliberate, slightly more itself, as though the year is gathering its final clarity before it lets go. She was in the stable when Pip brought her the package. She opened it in the yard, between the stable door and the paddock fence, with Arthur and Pip nearby doing a thoroughly unconvincing impression of not watching. She took one copy out and held it for a moment. It had a clean cover, with a good illustration of a horse in profile, simply and clearly done. She gave the copy to Pip. He looked at it, and then at her. "For the library," she said, "when we have one." He told her they did not have a library. She said, "We will." He looked at her, with the look of a young man who has spent enough years watching someone build things from nothing that he has stopped being surprised by anything they intend to do next. He took the book. That afternoon, she rode Patience. Patience was a gray gelding, the finest product of Constance's breeding program, born in the spring of the year the royal warrant first arrived, and now 6 years old, and fully what his breeding and his early promise had always suggested he would be. He had been trained carefully and slowly over 4 years, with no hurrying at any stage, and he had become an animal of exceptional quality in every regard. She rode him most days when the weather allowed. She had adapted her position and her approach completely to accommodate her leg, working with a thoughtful trainer over a period of years to develop a method that was sound and effective and suited precisely to her particular circumstances. On horseback there was no limp. There was no cane leaning against a fence post. There was only the movement and the conversation between rider and horse, and in this, she had found something she could not fully put into words, and had not tried to, because not everything that is real needs to be explained. She rode Patience to the far end of the farm, past the extended stable and the well-kept paddocks, past Percy's field, where the gray mare was grazing, with the calm authority of an animal who has found her proper place, past the cottage, where Tom's door stood open in the warm afternoon light. She stopped at the far boundary fence. From there she could see all of Thornfield. The farmhouse with its repaired roof and its window boxes. The stable block, solid and well managed. The paddocks with their good timber fencing. The yard with the brass plate on the gatepost catching the late September sun. Arthur's figure moving between the stalls at the near end. Pip working with the young horses. Bess visible through the kitchen window. She had arrived at this place in the mud and the rain, with a cane and a trunk, and 42 pounds, and a list she had made at a candle-lit kitchen table, to keep herself from standing still in the shock of it. She had arrived here placed by a man who thought discarding her was simple and final, the way discarding a broken thing is simple and final, without considering that some things that appear broken are simply not finished yet. She had arrived at a rotting gate with missing bars, in front of a farmhouse with a boarded window and a cracked chimney, and a crow sitting on the roof with no particular concern. And she had looked at all of it. She had not wept, she had made a list. She looked at the farm for a long time from the far fence. Patience moved beneath her, a slight shift of weight and attention, the particular signal of a horse with energy to spend and room ahead of him. She knew the signal. She always knew the signal. She turned him toward the open field. She let him run. He ran the way genuinely exceptional horses run, when they are given room, and given permission, with a long, full, free stride, and the complete commitment of an animal that holds nothing back. The ground came up under them, and the autumn air moved past, and the farm fell behind, and then came around again, as she turned him in a long arc. And when she came around toward the yard, she could see the brass plate on the gate, catching the light one more time, and the whole of Thornfield was there in that one moment, all of it at once. The years and the work and the people and the animals and the patience it had required and the patience it had produced. The morning she had arrived and this afternoon and everything that had grown in the ground between those 2 points. She brought Patience back to a canter as they came in toward the yard. Pip was at the fence to receive him, and Arthur had the stable door open, and from the kitchen window came the movement that meant Bess was there and supper would be ready, and 4 miles away, in the direction of the low hills, a man was very likely sitting in his library, with a book open on his knee, but would come if she sent word. She would send word. She dismounted at the fence, and took her cane from where it rested against the post, and Pip took Patience's rein, with the ease of long practice, and she stood for one last moment, in the yard of the farm she had built, entirely, from the material of her own determination, in the September light, with the sound of the horses around her, and the smell of the autumn, and the good solid weight of a place that was hers, in every sense the word contained. Fairweather had asked her once, in the sitting room over tea, whether she was happy. She had told him she was more herself than she had ever been in her life, and she had said she thought that must count as happiness. She still thought so. She was certain of it now. She walked across the yard to the farmhouse door and went inside, and the door closed behind her, and the farm continued around her as it always did, with the steady and purposeful sound of a place that has found its right way of being in the world, and intends to keep it. Ilara Ashmont Voss never remarried. She expanded Thornfield twice more in her lifetime, and the royal warrant was never revoked or transferred to any other establishment during her tenure. Pip became one of the most highly regarded equestrians in the north of England, and credited her in every professional conversation he ever had, without exception and without being asked to do so. Old Tom lived at Thornfield for the rest of his life, walking to the paddock fence each morning until the morning he did not, and was buried in the small churchyard in the village. with Ilara and Pip and Arthur and Bess all present, and with 4 of the farm's horses brought to stand at the field gate, in the way that working country people sometimes mark a passing. Bess served as house manager of Thornfield for 23 years after being given the title and the proper salary, and she outlived everyone in this account. The book went to 5 editions. Duke Aldrich Voss died in London in a year that the farm's records simply do not mention. Thornfield outlasted him by a very long time.